It started like any other night in Las Vegas. The neon lights painted the sky in bright, electric colors, casting a surreal glow over the streets. The famous Strip, a highway of excess, was bustling with people, tourists, gamblers, partygoers, and showgirls. The air was filled with the ringing sound of slot machines, laughter, and the endless chatter of people trying their luck. Everything felt alive. It was Vegas, the city that never sleeps, and the energy was intoxicating. The beats of the latest club anthem echoed from the open doors of the hottest nightclubs, and people lined up for cocktails, eager to drink away their worries. The night seemed endless, a world of light, music, and high stakes. But something was different tonight. It started slowly at first. The kind of thing you might not notice until it was already too late. The streets, usually packed with tourists, began to thin out. The neon signs flashing above felt less vibrant, as if the lights themselves had dimmed ever so slightly. There was a subtle shift in the air, a change that made the hairs on the back of your neck stand up. It wasn't the usual chaos, the usual buzz of energy that everyone was used to. No, tonight was off. People started looking around, confused, glancing over their shoulders like they were being watched. The first sign of something wrong was a man stumbling down the sidewalk, his hands shaking uncontrollably. His clothes were ragged, his face pale. He was drenched in sweat, his eyes wild. But it wasn't the look of someone intoxicated. No, this man was far beyond that. There was something deeply wrong with him. He was unnatural. His movements were jerky, like a marionette with its strings pulled the wrong way. A couple of people walked past him, glancing at him with curiosity, some chuckling under their breath. Maybe they thought he was just another tourist who had gotten a little too carried away with the party scene. But then, another person appeared, a woman this time. She was dressed in a glittering dress, her heels clicking on the pavement, her hair perfect as she passed by the flashing lights. She was talking to her friends, laughing. But when she saw the man, stabbed, her smile faltered, her steps slowed. Something in the air had shifted, and she could feel it, too. The man's gaze locked onto hers, his mouth twisted in an eerie, unnatural grin. There was no warmth in his eyes, no recognition, just something cold and animalistic. It was then that she noticed the blood, dark, sticky blood, that stained his lips and chin, as if he'd just come from a massacre. But it didn't matter. People were running, shouting, but no one knew where to go. It was too late. The woman's scream echoed in the chaos, but it wasn't the scream of joy that Las Vegas was known for. No, this was a scream of pure, unadulterated terror. It cut through the night, freezing the blood of everyone who heard it. And then, just like that, the city of lights and glamour became something else entirely. People scattered in every direction, some tripping over one another, their heels clacking on the pavement as they tried to escape. The streets, which had been alive with the sounds of life, were now filled with panic and confusion. It was like a wave of fear had washed over the crowd. As more and more people ran, the first sign of danger spread like wildfire. The neon signs seemed to flicker, casting eerie shadows over the terrified faces of those now in a desperate race for survival. Jake, a young man who had been enjoying the night at a nearby bar, pushed his way through the crowd. He wasn't sure what was happening, but he could hear the panic in the voices around him. His heart was racing, but there was something in the air that made him stop for a moment. He turned to look just in time to see the woman's lifeless body being dragged away by the man. Her body wasn't limp anymore. No, it was as if she had risen again, her eyes wide and vacant, her mouth gaping open as she clawed at anyone who came too close. Jake's stomach churned as he watched in horror. The woman he had just seen moments ago, dancing and laughing with friends, was now a mindless monster, her human features barely recognizable. She was one of them now, one of the undead. The sound of screams grew louder as more of the strange figures began appearing, their faces grotesque, their bodies lurching in unnatural motions. It didn't take long before the horror was in full swing. People who had moments ago been enjoying a carefree night in Vegas were now fighting for their lives. The city had turned into a nightmare, and there was no place to hide. Jake pushed forward, his pulse pounding in his ears, adrenaline coursing through his veins. He didn't know what was happening, but he had to get to safety. As he ran toward the entrance of a nearby casino, he caught sight of another person stumbling across the street. She was a young woman, probably in her late 20s, her face streaked with blood. Her clothes were torn, and her hair hung limp around her shoulders. Her eyes locked onto Jake's for a moment before she charged at him, growling low in her throat. It was the same look. He barely managed to dodge her as she lunged at him, the stench of death filling his nose. He shoved her away with all the strength he had, but the creature didn't stop. It scrambled to its feet and charged again, its teeth bared. In the chaos of the moment, Jake didn't know what to do. He stumbled back, his foot catching on a curb. And then he saw the others. More people had become zombies. The city, in a matter of minutes, was overrun. Jake turned and ran, his heart hammering in his chest as the sound of footsteps followed behind him. The moans of the undead getting louder with each passing second. He didn't stop to think. He didn't stop to ask questions. All he knew was that he had to survive. And Las Vegas, the city that never sleeps, was now a place where no one would ever be safe again. A blood-curdling sound of more screams echoed through the streets, drowning out the sounds of the machines and the laughter. The lights, once bright and comforting, now seemed to mock the chaos below. This was no longer a city of sin. This was a city of death. In that moment, it was clear Las Vegas was under attack, but not by humans. These were the undead, and they had come to claim everything. The Strip descended into madness. What was once a symbol of joy, excess, and freedom now lay in chaos. The sounds of laughter, slot machines, and music were replaced by screams of terror, agony, and fear. The neon lights that had lit the night sky with vibrant colors now flickered like dying stars, casting an eerie glow over the carnage unfolding below. The world had turned upside down in an instant, and no one was safe. Cars were no longer cruising leisurely along the strip. Instead, they were careening out of control, crashing into each other, their drivers helpless in the face of the insanity that had taken over. Jake, a former bartender at one of the most popular casinos on the Strip, found himself in the middle of the madness. He had just finished his shift when the first signs of the outbreak began. What had seemed like just another busy night of serving drinks and listening to the chatter of tourists had quickly turned into a nightmare. At first, he thought it was some kind of prank. A group of people stumbling down the street in strange, jerky movements, groaning and growling, seemed like an odd piece of performance art. But the moment the first scream pierced the night, everything changed. Jake had stepped outside for a quick break, his nerves slightly frayed from the constant noise and the endless cycle of serving customers. He had barely lit his cigarette when he saw the first person fall. At first, he thought she had tripped, but then she didn't get up. A man, her companion perhaps, knelt beside her, trying to help her. But as soon as he touched her, she turned on him. With terrifying speed, she sank her teeth into his neck, and blood poured out, staining the concrete red. He watched in horror as people ran past him, some of them knocking him to the ground in their desperate scramble for safety. His heart pounded in his chest as he picked himself up. His instinct was clear. Run! He didn't think twice as he pushed his way through the throngs of panicked people. Every step he took, he saw something worse. More and more of the strange figures appeared, their faces grotesque, their eyes vacant. They moved with terrifying precision, tearing through the crowd, grabbing and ripping at anyone within reach. Jake sprinted across the sidewalk, trying to avoid the growing number of undead that now seemed to be everywhere. It was a blur of blood and chaos. People were screaming, but the sound of their voices was drowned out by the roar of the city, the deafening crash of cars, and the sickening growls of the zombies. The air was thick with fear. He could smell the blood, the sweat, the panic. He could hear the sickening crunch of bones as the zombies tore into their prey. No one was safe. There was nowhere to hide. As he turned a corner, he nearly collided with another person, a man running for his life. His face was pale, his eyes wide with terror. "They're everywhere," the man shouted, his voice shaky. "We need to get out of here." But Jake didn't have the luxury of stopping. The man grabbed Jake's arm, but he pulled away, pushing forward with every ounce of strength. Turning another corner, Jake spotted the entrance to a casino, his last hope for shelter. The glass doors slid open automatically, and he rushed inside, slamming them shut behind him. Inside, the casino was relatively calm, but it was far from normal. Jake leaned against a slot machine, panting, his mind racing. The casino was full of people, but it didn't feel safe. He knew that even in here, the threat wasn't over. It could only be a matter of time before the undead found their way in. Jake's blood ran cold as he saw the man collapse to the floor. But instead of dying, he began to twitch violently. His hands gripped the carpet, and he lifted his head slowly, his eyes glazing over. Jake froze, realizing what was happening. The man was turning. The undead were spreading faster than anyone could have anticipated. It wasn't just outside. It was inside. The city and everything he had known was slipping away. Without warning, the man lunged. His eyes were no longer human. He was a monster. Jake barely managed to dodge him, but the man's outstretched hands caught his arm. Jake stumbled backward, his mind racing for a plan. He needed to get out, but the casino was already becoming a death trap. People were starting to scream. Some ran toward the exits, but others, frozen in fear, were too late. The undead had already made it inside, and now they were attacking anyone within reach. Jake pushed through the crowd, weaving in and out, trying to avoid the zombies and the panic-stricken people who were trampling over one another in a desperate attempt to escape. As he reached a stairwell, he heard another scream, this one louder, more desperate. He spun around, his heart racing as he saw a woman being dragged toward the doors by two zombies, their teeth tearing into her flesh. Her cries were cut off as the undead tore into her throat. Blood splattered across the floor, and Jake turned away, unable to watch any longer. The horror was too much. It was everywhere. Jake stumbled into the stairwell, shutting the door behind him. The sound of moaning and screeching echoed through the hall. He had no idea what to do, where to go. Las Vegas, the city he had once called home, had become something unrecognizable. The undead were everywhere, tearing through the crowds, and the streets were no longer safe. Jake wasn't sure how long he could survive, but for now, he would keep moving, keep running. There was no other choice. As the darkness of the stairwell closed in, Jake knew one thing for certain. There was no escaping this nightmare. Las Vegas had fallen, and he was just another survivor, running from the inevitable. By the time morning came, the streets of Las Vegas had fallen silent, except for the low, eerie groans that echoed from the ruins. The neon lights, once dazzling, now flickered weakly against the rising sun, casting long shadows over what had become a war zone. What had once been the world's most famous playground, a place of dreams, lights, and excess, was now a haunting graveyard, a battleground between the living and the dead. Buildings that had once stood tall were now abandoned, broken, and crumbling. The familiar sounds of the bustling strip, the laughter, the clinking of coins in the slot machines, the music from bars and clubs had been replaced by an unsettling quiet, only broken by the occasional shuffle of the undead and the distant sounds of people scrambling for safety. Jake had barely slept through the night. After finding his way to a small, darkened alley and taking refuge in a dingy bar, he had spent the hours that passed staring at the door, listening to the sounds of shuffling feet and muffled screams outside. The whiskey he had grabbed from the bar's shelf had helped dull the pain, but nothing could quiet the gnawing fear deep inside him. He wasn't a fighter. He wasn't trained to survive this. But he was still alive, and as the sun crept higher, something inside him stirred. If he was going to survive, he couldn't hide in the shadows forever. He had to fight back. With a shake of his head, Jake stood up, ignoring the dull headache pounding behind his eyes. He grabbed a kitchen knife from a nearby counter, its steel still gleaming, a far cry from the weapon he'd prefer to face the undead with. But it would have to do. The whiskey bottle, now only a third full, was clutched tightly in his other hand, offering little more than a false sense of security. He knew it wasn't enough, but it was all he had, and he'd have to make it work. As Jake made his way out of the alley, his boots echoed in the empty street, the sound of each step sending a jolt through his nerves. The air was heavy with the scent of decay. He could feel the weight of the city pressing in on him. The walls that had once been a symbol of excitement now felt like a prison. The air tasted like ash, and every breath felt like a struggle. He had to push forward. That's when he saw them, the other survivors, a group of 4, huddled together near the corner of a building, their faces grim and worn with exhaustion. They looked as beaten down as he felt. It wasn't hard to recognize them. They had the same look of people who had seen too much, who had already fought through the worst and were still alive. But barely. Jake hesitated for a moment. But then the woman at the front of the group looked up. Her eyes were hard, unblinking, as if she had already accepted the harsh reality that most people could only begin to fathom. "You're still alive?" she asked, her voice raw, a little hoarse. Jake nodded, swallowing hard. "Yeah, barely." "I'm Sarah," she said, offering a tight, thin smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Local cop. At least I was, until this all started." Jake stepped closer, realizing that she wasn't the only one who looked like she had been through hell. There was a young man named Adam, his clothes torn, his face covered in dirt, but his eyes were alert, always scanning their surroundings. Then there was Claire, a middle-aged woman with a calm demeanor that belied the fear Jake could see in her eyes. Lastly, there was Greg, a former soldier who hadn't spoken much since Jake had arrived. He just kept his head down, his fingers constantly twitching toward the holster where his gun used to be, as if he still expected the world to make sense, like he could go back to the comfort of rules and regulations. Sarah looked at the ragtag group, then back at Jake. "We have to get to the strip," she said. Jake didn't know if she was speaking to him or herself, but the words struck a chord in him. The look in her eyes was different now. There was fire there. It wasn't just survival. It was about fighting back. It was about taking the city back from the things that had stolen it from them. The thought filled him with both terror and determination. It wasn't enough to hide. They had to do something, or they'd end up like the people who had already fallen. He swallowed again, nodding. "I'm in. What's the plan?" "We'll head to the heart of the strip," Sarah said. "We need to make our stand there. There's an old fire station near the Flamingo, and it might still have supplies. If we can get there, we can plan our next move. The problem is getting through the streets." Jake couldn't argue with her logic. The streets were crawling with zombies, moving through the city with disturbing precision. But that was their only shot. Standing still would get them killed. The group moved together, their pace quick and silent. The first few blocks were eerily quiet, save for the occasional groan or shuffle coming from the shadows. They stuck close to the walls, always moving from cover to cover, never letting their guard down. Every step felt like a countdown, every corner a potential death trap. Jake's heart pounded in his chest, the adrenaline pushing him forward despite the crippling fear. As they approached the first intersection, Jake's nerves were on edge. His hand tightened around the kitchen knife, feeling the cold steel. He glanced around, making sure the others were still behind him. The sound of shuffling feet reached his ears. Low moans filled the air, and in the distance, Jake could make out the shapes of the undead staggering through the street. He motioned for the group to stop, pressing his back. They waited, the seconds dragging on like hours, the moans growing louder, the footsteps getting closer. Jake's breath caught in his throat as the first zombie rounded the corner, its clothes hanging in tatters, its eyes glazed over, fixed on the survivors. And then more followed, each one moving slowly but steadily, hungry, relentless. Jake looked at Sarah, his eyes wide with fear. "We need to move. Now," she whispered urgently. Without another word, the group sprang into action. They moved quickly, ducking into alleyways, using the abandoned cars and debris as cover. Jake could feel his heart beating faster, the fear coursing through his veins as they navigated the streets. Every step felt like it might be their last. Every corner they turned. As they neared the heart of the strip, the intensity of the chaos around them increased. Zombies were everywhere, crawling, shambling, attacking anyone they could catch. The group had to keep moving, pushing through the madness, determined to reach their destination. Sarah's words kept echoing in Jake's mind. "Vegas is ours. We just have to fight for it." He didn't know how they could possibly win. But there was one thing he knew for sure. They couldn't give up now. There was no turning back. The air felt thick, heavy with the weight of everything they had just been through. The once vibrant Las Vegas Strip now seemed like a battlefield, a city under siege, a place of chaos and death. The group moved cautiously, their every step calculated, the sound of shuffling feet, the low groans of the undead, and the distant screams echoed around them. Jake felt his pulse racing in his chest. The fear was almost suffocating, but there was no time to waste. They had made it this far, and there was no turning back now. As they reached the middle of the strip, their pace slowed. Something didn't feel right. Jake could sense it before he even saw it. It was the way the air seemed to hang heavy around them, the unnatural stillness that had fallen over the city. He glanced around, scanning the streets for any signs of movement. There were the usual scattered undead wandering aimlessly. Ahead, near the iconic Luxor Hotel, a large group of zombies had gathered. They weren't just attacking, They were organized. It wasn't like the random chaos that had spread throughout the city since the outbreak. These zombies were moving with purpose, standing together in a huddled mass, as though they were waiting for something. Jake's heart skipped a beat. He had seen plenty of zombies since the outbreak. But this was different. They weren't just mindless creatures anymore. There was a force behind this. Something pulling the strings. Something orchestrating the madness. We need to destroy the leader, whatever or whoever that is, Jake said. His voice tight as he gripped the kitchen knife in his hand. His knuckles whitened from the pressure, his eyes never leaving the horde ahead of them. He could feel the hairs on the back of his neck standing up. This wasn't just survival anymore. There was a strategy to it. The thought of facing whatever was leading this pack made his stomach churn. But he couldn't show weakness. Not now. Not when they had come so far. Sarah, the local cop who had become their de facto leader, nodded grimly. She was just as shaken as Jake, but she wasn't about to let fear dictate their actions. "We're not going to make it if we don't," she said, her voice steady, but laced with an edge of urgency. She had been through enough to know that there was no room for hesitation. Not anymore. But the closer they got to the Luxor, the more intense the situation became. The zombies in front of them weren't just standing still anymore. They were moving. Slowly but purposefully, in a way that didn't seem natural. They shuffled toward the entrance of the Luxor, gathering around as if they were drawn there by something. As they watched, a low, guttural sound echoed from within the building. It wasn't a moan of hunger. It was a command. As if the undead were responding to a call. Jake's eyes narrowed. "What the hell is that?" he muttered, his grip tightening around the knife. He took a step forward, his senses on high alert. The group followed behind him, their movements cautious. That's when they saw it. At the center of the horde, towering above the others, was something different. The creature wasn't like the other zombies. It was bigger, its body more intact, its movements sharper. It moved with purpose, as though it had a mind of its own. Its eyes glowed with an unnatural intensity, a malevolent fire that sent a chill down Jake's spine. This wasn't a random zombie. This was the leader. The one who had brought the horde together. The one who had orchestrated the attack on Las Vegas. Jake's breath caught in his throat. He had heard rumors, whispers of something worse than the mindless zombies that had taken over cities across the country. Some said there was a master zombie, one that could control the others, but to see it with his own eyes was something else entirely. The creature, the leader, was standing tall. The rest of the horde seemed to move with a strange synchrony, following the leader's every step. It was terrifying, the way they moved together, as if they were a single entity rather than a mass of scattered creatures. They weren't just mindless beasts anymore. They were an army, and this army was led by something far more dangerous than anything Jake had faced before. Is that the leader? Greg whispered, his voice trembling with disbelief. He had seen his fair share of battles, but nothing like this. Nothing that could prepare him for this kind of threat. Jake nodded grimly. Yeah, and we're going to have to take it down if we want any chance of surviving this. But how? Claire asked, her voice shaking. We're not even armed well enough to fight that thing. How are we supposed to take down a leader zombie? Sarah took a deep breath, her eyes never leaving the leader. We have no choice. We fight or we die. She glanced back at the group. We move fast. We go in, take out the leader, and destroy the rest of the horde. We do this together, or none of us make it. The group nodded in agreement, but Jake could see the doubt in their eyes. They were all scared, terrified even, but they knew that this was their only shot. They couldn't afford to hesitate. They had to act, and they had to act now. The sound of shuffling feet grew louder as more zombies appeared, drawn to the noise. The horde was swelling. There was no more time to plan. They had to move. Jake's heart raced as he took a deep breath. Let's do this. He nodded towards Sarah, who signaled for them to move. The first zombie lunged at them, its mouth wide open, teeth gnashing. Jake swung his knife, catching it across the throat. The creature fell, but it was quickly replaced by another, then another. They were everywhere. The group fought with everything they had, slashing, stabbing, and shooting when they could. The sound of metal slicing through flesh echoed in the air, mingling with the horrifying growls of the undead. But through it all, Jake's eyes stayed focused on the leader. The creature was still standing tall, directing the horde with a chilling presence. It wasn't just mindlessly feeding. It was leading them. Jake knew that if they didn't take it down soon, they would be completely overwhelmed. They fought their way forward, the zombies getting more aggressive, more relentless. Every time they thought they had a moment to breathe, another wave would hit. The street was littered with bodies, both undead and human. It was a bloody, chaotic scene. The Strip, once a symbol of indulgence, had now become a war zone. Jake's knife slipped from his grip as another zombie grabbed him by the arm, sinking its teeth into his flesh. He screamed in pain, but managed to wrench himself free, falling backward onto the ground. He could feel the blood trickling down his arm, his vision blurring. He had to keep going. There was no other choice. "Jake!" Sarah shouted, pulling him back to his feet. "We need to keep moving." With a growl, Jake forced himself to stand, ignoring the pain in his arm. His focus was laser-sharp now. The leader was getting closer. "Now!" Jake shouted, charging toward the leader, knife in hand, his pulse pounding in his ears. The leader zombie turned to face him, its movements faster than anything Jake had seen. It lunged at him, but Jake was ready. With one swift motion, he buried the knife deep into its chest. The creature's eyes widened in shock, its twisted grin faltering for just a moment. The horde faltered, disoriented for a split second, and that was all they needed. The survivors pressed forward, fighting with everything they had, determined to take the city back. But the battle was far from over. The undead were still everywhere, relentless in their pursuit of flesh. The fight for Las Vegas had just begun, and Jake wasn't sure how much longer they could hold out. In the heart of the Strip, the group stood still, their eyes locked on the scene before them. The city, once a gleaming oasis of luxury and excess, had become a dark, twisted shell of its former self. The once glittering lights now flickered weakly, casting long, ominous shadows across the blood-soaked streets. The smell of decay hung in the air, a constant reminder of the carnage that had unfolded. It was here, amid the rubble and destruction, that they found their enemy. The leader zombie was unlike any they had seen before. It towered over the others, its body unnaturally large, with skin stretched tightly over the bones, as if the creature was barely holding itself together. Its eyes glowed with a fierce, unnatural light, a stark contrast to the hollow, vacant eyes of the other zombies. It wasn't just faster than the others. It was stronger, too. The way it moved, jerky and unnatural, was almost human. But there was no mistaking the malevolent presence it carried. It wasn't just a mindless, hungry monster. It was something more. Something they could no longer ignore. Jake's heart raced as he stood beside Sarah, Adam, Claire, and Greg. The sound of the horde moaning and shuffling in the distance was deafening. But for now, their focus was entirely on the creature before them. It wasn't just any zombie. This one had led them here. This was the... "This is it," Sarah whispered, her voice steady, despite the fear that flickered in her eyes. She had been through hell, but even she couldn't hide the weight of what was to come. "We either win or we die trying." There was no room for doubt, no time for hesitation. They had come this far, and they couldn't afford to fail now. If they didn't stop this creature, if they didn't end this nightmare, Las Vegas would fall completely. The city that had once been a symbol of freedom and indulgence would be nothing more than a ghost town ruled by the undead. Jake gripped his knife tighter, his knuckles turning white. Sarah, the former police officer, checked her gun one last time. The metallic click of the chamber echoing in the silence. Adam, Claire, and Greg each armed themselves with whatever they could find. Broken bottles, pipes, anything that might give them a fighting chance. But none of them had the luxury of hope. They all knew the truth. Their weapons weren't enough. They were all outmatched, outnumbered, and out of time. The horde was still gathering, their growls and snarls growing louder as they moved closer. But they were nothing compared to the creature that stood before them. It was as if the rest of... Without a word, they charged. Jake moved first, his body propelled by adrenaline and fear. He lunged at the leader, his knife aimed straight for its chest. But the leader was too fast. It twisted its body with terrifying agility, sidestepping Jake's attack and swiping at him with claws that could tear through flesh with ease. Jake barely managed to roll out of the way, his heart pounding pounding in his chest as he scrambled to his feet. Behind him, Sarah fired her gun, the sharp crack of the shots piercing the air. Each bullet hit its mark, but it didn't seem to faze the leader. The creature's skin was thick, its body seemingly impervious to the onslaught. It let out a low, guttural growl, its eyes locked on Sarah, as if it knew she was the biggest threat. But before anyone could react, the leader moved again, its speed almost too fast to follow. It lunged at Sarah, knocking her to the ground with a brutal force. The sound of her body hitting the pavement was sickening, and for a moment, everything stopped. Jake's heart skipped a beat as he watched the leader pin Sarah down, its sharp claws digging into her shoulders. She fought back, her arms flailing, but she was no match for the strength of the creature. "No!" Jake screamed, rushing forward, his knife raised, ready to strike. But it was too late. Before he could reach her, the leader's teeth sank into Sarah's neck, and her scream was cut short. Blood poured from the wound, splattering across the pavement as the creature fed. Jake froze, his body paralyzed by the sight. Sarah, their leader, their hope, was gone. The others screamed in terror, but there was no time to mourn. Claire managed to stab one of the zombies through the eye, but before she could pull the knife free, another grabbed her from behind, sinking its teeth into her arm. Adam swung a pipe at a group of zombies, but they kept coming, their numbers too great. Greg fired off a few more shots, but it was clear they were out of ammo, out of time, and out of options. Jake, his body shaking with rage and grief, fought harder than he ever had in his life. He slashed through the zombies in front of him, his movements frantic, his hands slick with sweat and blood. He wasn't just fighting for survival anymore. He was fighting for Sarah, for the hope they had all shared, and for the chance to take back what had been lost. But the leader wasn't finished. It rose from Sarah's lifeless body, its glowing eyes fixed on Jake. It turned its head slightly, as if sizing him up. And then it lunged again, faster than Jake could react. The leader's claws ripped through his shirt, grazing his skin, leaving deep gashes along his chest. He stumbled back, gasping for breath, barely managing to stay on his feet. But then something inside him snapped. He couldn't let it end like this. Not without a fight. Not without giving everything he had. With a scream of defiance, Jake charged at the leader, his knife raised high. The creature swung at him, its claws aimed at his throat. But Jake ducked, dodging the attack just in time. He swung his knife downward, catching the leader across the side of its neck. The creature let out a screech of pain, stumbling back. For the first time, Jake saw fear in its eyes. He didn't hesitate. He drove the knife deep into its chest, twisting the blade with all the force he could muster. The leader gasped, its body spasming, before it finally collapsed to the ground, lifeless. The horde seemed to hesitate, its movements slowing. It was as if they were waiting for something, for a signal. But with their leader dead, they were nothing more than mindless creatures, aimlessly wandering the streets. Knew that they couldn't stop now. There was still more to fight for, more to lose. They had won the battle, but the war was far from over. And in this new world, there was only one rule: survive. The streets of Las Vegas were eerily quiet, a haunting silence that had replaced the usual roar of the city. The once vibrant strip, the heart of sin, now stood as a decaying monument to chaos and death. The neon lights, once flashing in every color of the rainbow, now flickered intermittently, casting long, unnatural shadows across the streets. Broken windows and abandoned cars littered the roads, and the air, thick with the scent of decay and blood, hung heavy with the weight of the city's fall. The world had changed, and there was no going back. Jake stood alone in the middle of the strip, his chest heaving with each breath. The weight of everything that had happened pressing down on him. His friends were gone. Sarah, Greg, Claire, and Adam. One by one, they had fallen in this relentless battle for survival. Sarah's death had hit him hardest. She had been their leader, their guiding force. But she was gone, torn apart by the very creature they had been fighting. And now, Jake was the last one standing, alone in a city that was no longer his home. A leader zombie, the monstrous creature that had orchestrated the destruction of the city, was still out there, somewhere. Jake could feel it. The undead horde had fallen apart without its leader, but the threat was far from over. The leader was relentless, stronger than anything they had encountered before. Jake knew that if he didn't act now, the city would remain a breeding ground for the undead. There would be no more survivors. A city of lights would become nothing but a graveyard. His hand tightened around the kitchen knife, now slick with the blood of countless zombies. He had fought through hell to get this far, and he wasn't going to give up now. He glanced at the desolate landscape around him, the remnants of a city that had once been alive with laughter, music, and people. Now it was a ghost town, a place of death. Jake could hear the distant moans of zombies, wandering aimlessly, searching for their next meal. But Jake knew there was only one thing that needed to be done. The leader had to be stopped, and it had to be him who did it. There was no one left to fight for the city. The responsibility was his, whether he liked it or not. Jake took a deep breath, his eyes narrowing as he looked toward the horizon, where the Luxor pyramid stood in the distance. He could see the faint silhouette of the leader's zombie, standing tall among the scattered remains of the undead. It was watching him, waiting, as if it knew that the final confrontation was inevitable. Jake's heart pounded in his chest as he moved forward, his footsteps echoing through the empty streets. Each step felt like an eternity, and the weight of his friends' deaths weighed heavily on him. As he approached the Luxor, the leader turned its head, its glowing eyes locking onto Jake's. A low, guttural growl escaped from the creature's throat, and its monstrous form shifted, ready to charge. Jake's grip on the knife tightened, his knuckles white. He had no illusions about what he was up against. This wasn't just a mindless zombie. This was a creature driven by a primal instinct, a force of nature that had brought chaos to the city. It wasn't going to go down easily. Jake felt the adrenaline coursing through his veins. This was it. This was his last stand. He wasn't going to let the leader destroy everything. He had already lost so much. He wasn't going to lose himself too. The leader charged forward with terrifying speed, its massive form cutting through the air like a predator closing in on its prey. Jake barely had time to react as the creature lunged at him, its claws extended, ready to tear him apart. He dodged to the side, barely avoiding the creature's grasp. The leader's claws scraped against the pavement, sending sparks flying as it missed its mark. Jake didn't have time to celebrate his narrow escape. He swung the knife at the leader, but it was too fast. The blade barely made contact, the creature's thick skin deflecting the blow. Jake stumbled backward, his heart pounding as he searched for an opening. The leader was relentless, its movements fluid and unnatural. It wasn't like the other zombies. It was too powerful, too fast. Every time Jake thought he had a chance to strike, the leader was already on him, its claws tearing through the air. Jake was exhausted. His body ached from the constant fighting, and the wound on his arm burned with every movement. He could feel the weight of his injuries slowing him down. The leader, however, seemed to be getting stronger, faster, with every passing moment. Jake barely managed to dodge another swipe of the leader's claws. He stumbled, his foot catching on a piece of broken concrete. The leader lunged, its jaws snapping shut, just inches from Jake's face. He could smell its rancid breath, the stench of death overwhelming him. With a desperate yell, Jake thrust the knife forward, aiming for the creature's chest. The blade sank deep into the leader's flesh, and for a moment, everything stopped. The leader let out a chilling screech, its body convulsing as it recoiled. Jake felt a surge of hope. Could this be it? Had he finally stopped the creature that had terrorized the city? But the leader wasn't finished. With a roar of rage, it threw Jake aside, sending him crashing into a nearby car. The impact knocked the wind out of him, and for a moment, everything went black. When Jake opened his eyes, he saw the leader looming over him, its eyes burning with hatred. The creature raised its claws, ready to strike the final blow. Jake knew this was it. There was silence, as if the two were locked in a final, unspoken standoff. Then, with a roar, Jake charged. He wasn't going to give up. Not without a fight. With all the strength he had left, Jake plunged the knife into the leader's chest again, twisting the blade with everything he had. The leader let out one last screech, its body convulsing as it fell to the ground, lifeless. Jake stepped back, his breath ragged, his body shaking. He had done it. The leader was dead. The sound of the horde began to fade as the zombies stopped moving. Their once coordinated movements, now erratic and disorganized. They no longer had a purpose. With the leader gone, the zombies were nothing more than mindless creatures, stumbling aimlessly through the streets. Jake stood there, panting, covered in blood, knowing that he had saved what was left of Las Vegas. But the victory came at a high price. His friends were gone. Sarah, Greg, Claire, and Adam. All lost in the battle. Vegas would never be the same. The city of dreams, the city of lights, was now a shadow of its former self. The fight for survival had taken everything from him, and he couldn't shake the feeling that something darker was still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. Las Vegas was no longer the place of lights and glamour. It was a haunted wasteland, a city forever scarred by the undead. Jake, the last survivor, walked away from the ruins, the weight of everything that had happened pressing down on him. As he moved through the empty streets, the silence was deafening. The city, once alive with laughter and music, now stood as a testament to the horrors that had unfolded. And as Jake walked away, he couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was still to come. Something darker was out there. Something that had yet to be uncovered. But for now, Jake could only hope that he had done enough to save what was left of the city he had once loved.